The chemical smell of the hospital room was the first thing that hit me. The second was the hiss of the oxygen mask strapped to my face. I opened my eyes. Everything was sterile. White. My memories were a blur of smoke and sirens. And my face still felt sticky with soot from the apartment fire. I fumbled for the phone. My hands were shaking. I needed my parents. My father. David. Picked up on the fourth ring. His voice was impatient. Like I'd interrupted something. Dad. I whispered. My throat was raw. Dad. My apartment. It burned down. There was a pause. Not a shocked pause. A cold, calculating pause. This is terrible timing. May. He finally said. His voice was flat. We have the Chronicle's food critic tonight. We'll send flowers. The line clicked. He'd hung up. I stared at the white ceiling. The beep of the heart monitor filling the air. The silence he left behind felt colder and more suffocating than the smoke ever did. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Lying there, with the rhythmic beep of the monitor as the only sound, the numbness started to fade, and something cold and heavy replaced it. Clarity. This wasn't new. This was just louder. My whole life. I was an accessory to the brand. My parents, David and Kimberly, weren't just parents, they were curators. Their masterpiece was their high-end restaurant. A cold, minimalist space of polished concrete and single-origin everything. They were the perfect hosts. The power couple. Always dressed. Always smiling. Always networking. Their restaurant was the golden child. I was the other one. The quiet graphic designer. Not a doctor. Not a lawyer. Nothing they could easily brag about at their dinner parties. I remembered my college graduation. I stood on the lawn, holding my diploma, scanning the crowd for them. They weren't there. I got a text later. So sorry. Darling, we had an emergency tasting with the new sommelier. You understand. I always understood. I understood when I had to take out loans and work 2 jobs to pay my own tuition. Because all their capital needed to be reinvested in a new marble bar. I understood when they missed my 21st birthday for a critical networking opportunity. I remember calling them, bursting with pride. When I landed my first real design job, there was a pause on the phone. And then my mother, Kimberly, said in her smooth, hostess voice, "Oh, well, that's nice. Dear, at least it's an office job." At least, that's when I should have understood. I was sitting in that sterile hospital room, lungs aching from the smoke. And it finally clicked. I wasn't their daughter. I was a transaction. In their world, you were either an asset or a liability. A child who got into an Ivy League law school was an asset. A child who could be paraded around, who added to the brand, was an asset. A daughter who gets her apartment burned down, who calls from an emergency room on the same night as a major food critic review. She isn't a person in crisis. She's a liability. She's a messy, inconvenient complication that doesn't fit the narrative. My fire wasn't a tragedy to them. It was just a bad line item on their perfectly balanced ledger. The flowers they promised, they would be an asset. A beautiful, tasteful arrangement that proved they were caring parents. The visit itself, that was a liability. It cost them time. It cost them focus. My father's words echoed in my head. This is terrible timing. I stared at the white, acoustic tile ceiling. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. I just felt the click of a final puzzle piece sliding into place. The picture it formed was devastating. And for the first time, it was perfectly clear. At 3 a.m, in the dim blue light of the hospital room, I made a decision. I didn't call my parents back. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. The clarity I felt was cold and sharp. They'd hung up, and I would hang up, too. In my own way. I swiped through my contacts, past David and Kimberly, and dialed the only number I knew I could trust. Aunt Michelle, my father's older sister. She picked up on the second ring, her voice sleepy, but immediately concerned. May, what's wrong? What happened? Auntie Michelle, I whispered. And only when I heard her warm voice did my throat tighten. My apartment! It's on fire! I'm in the hospital. There wasn't a moment's silence. No calculation. No question of when. She only said 2 words. I'm coming. 45 minutes later, the door to the hospital room opened. Aunt Michelle walked in, still wearing her nightgown, her silver hair hastily pulled back into a bun. She carried a small bag, and a wave of warmth seemed to fill the sterile room. She didn't say anything. She just walked over, brushed a lock of soot-stained hair from my forehead, and took my hand. You're not alone, she said firmly. The nurse said they need someone to sign the paperwork. I'll take care of everything. When Aunt Michelle turned away to talk to the nurse, I closed my eyes. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe, even though my lungs still hurt. 2 days later, Aunt Michelle drove me out of the hospital. We didn't go to my parents' restaurant. We drove to the suburbs, to her cozy little house. Entering Aunt Michelle's house was like entering a completely different world. My parents' restaurant was polished concrete, stainless steel, and cold silence. Aunt Michelle's house was a mess of life. Stacks of books towered in every corner. Ivy creeped along the windowsills. The air smelled of old paper, sundust, and herbal tea. It wasn't a gallery, it was a home. She took me to the guest room and respread the old quilt. You rest, she said softly. I'll make soup. The next few days passed in a peace I'd never known. Aunt Michelle cared for me. She didn't ask many questions, but she listened. She brought me tea and soup, sat with me as I just stared out into the garden. For the first time in my life, I felt safe, seen. My belongings were gone. Everything. My clothes, my furniture, everything I'd worked so hard to get. All except one thing. In my panic, as the fire raged, as the smoke thickened, I grabbed one thing. It was a small fireproof box I kept under my bed. It lay on Aunt Michelle's living room floor. A gray, heat-scratched object. Aunt Michelle looked at it. What is it? Honey. I knelt down and unlatched it. Inside were not jewelry or money. They were hard drives that held all my design work. And underneath them, wrapped in a plastic bag, were my old sketchbooks. The designs, the ideas, the real parts of me that I had hidden away because they were not prestigious enough. It was the one thing I saved. It was my symbol. I saved myself. The peace of my aunt's house lasted for about a week. I was just starting to feel human again. My lungs healing. My hands steady enough to hold a coffee cup without spilling. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sketching idly in a new notebook, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number. Is this May? A professional voice asked. Yes. This is she. This is Mark, from United Mutual Adjusters. I'm handling the claim for your apartment. First, I'm so sorry for your loss. It looks like the fire investigation cleared, and the claim for a total loss has been approved. I felt a small wave of relief. Thank you. So, what happens now? The payout for personal property and displacement is $80,000. He said. I almost dropped the phone. 80,000. It was enough to start over. It was enough to be safe. That's... Wow. Thank you, I said. Then, there was a pause. The kind of pause that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Miss, he said, his voice dropping a little. Oh, I'm a little confused about the beneficiary information. Your father. Ah, Mr. David. He called my office this morning. My blood went cold. He did. Yes. He said he was the primary beneficiary on the policy, and that he was managing your affairs. He was very insistent that we wire the $80,000 directly to his company's corporate account. Something about asset management to help you. I couldn't speak. The room started to feel small. He hadn't called to see if I was alive. He hadn't sent the flowers he promised. But he had found the time to call my insurance company to try and claim my money. Miss, are you still there? Mark asked. Do not, I said, my voice shaking, but low and clear. Do not send him anything. That is my policy. I am the sole claimant. Is that understood? Yes. Of course, he said, sounding relieved. I thought something was strange. The policy is in your name. We will mail the check directly to you. Can I get a forwarding address? I gave him Aunt Michelle's address, thanked him, and hung up the phone. My hands were clamped so tightly around the device. My knuckles were white. He wasn't just neglectful. He wasn't just cold. He was a thief. Aunt Michelle walked in, holding 2 mugs of tea. She saw my face and set them down slowly. May, what is it? What happened? I told her. I told her about the $80,000. And about our father's phone call. I told her he tried to have the money sent to his restaurant's bank account. I expected her to be shocked. I expected her to be angry for me. Instead, her face went perfectly, terrifyingly still. She looked down at the kitchen counter, not at me, and her voice was a flat, tainted, cold whisper. Of course he did. She looked up, and her eyes were filled with a kind of ancient, familiar pain. May, she said, pulling out the chair opposite me. There's something I never told you about your father. About my brother. She took a deep breath. When your grandparents, my parents, passed away, it was 20 years ago. They didn't have much, but they left us the family house and a small savings. It was supposed to be split. 50-50. My half was just enough to go back to school, get my master's degree, maybe put a down payment on a place of my own. She stared at the wall, seeing something I couldn't. David was the executor of the will. He told me the estate was complicated, that there were hidden debts. He said he would manage my half for me, that he'd invested in his brilliant new business idea. The first restaurant. He said he'd double it for me in a year. She let out a short, bitter laugh. I was young. I trusted him. He was my big brother. Aunt Michelle. No. Yes, she said, finally meeting my eyes. The restaurant failed. A year later, he told me the money was all gone. Every penny. My inheritance. He'd used it to pay off his suppliers and his bad debts. And I was left with nothing. He ruined me. May. He ruined my future to fund his first failure. My stomach turned. And you never. I didn't fight back, she said, her voice filled with self-loathing. I was ashamed. I was broken. He was my brother. And he told me I was making a scene when I cried. He said family helps each other out. So I kept quiet. I let him destroy me. And I kept quiet for 20 years. Just to keep the peace. She leaned across the table. And her hand, the one that had felt so warm and safe just days before, was now trembling with a cold, focused rage. He is not doing it again, she whispered, her voice like steel. I let him do it to me, but I will not let him do it to you. She stood up and walked over to the phone. I'm calling a lawyer. Aunt Michelle made the call that afternoon. Her voice was low and steady, a stark contrast to the quiet rage I'd seen in her eyes. She was talking to Michael, a lawyer she'd known for years. A man who, she said, didn't tolerate nonsense. I sat at her kitchen table, twisting a paper napkin into shreds, listening to her explain the situation, in short, precise sentences. Yes, David. Yes, her renter's insurance. He tried to divert the payout. She listened for a long moment, her knuckles white on the receiver. Then she said, Michael, can you look into it? All of it. I have a feeling this is just the top layer. She hung up and looked at me, her face set. He'll make some calls. He'll find out what's really going on. We didn't have to wait long. Michael called back the next morning. Aunt Michelle put him on speakerphone. His voice was calm, professional, and sharp, like the edge of a new blade. Michelle. May. He started. I've got the documents. It's worse than we thought. My stomach clenched. What do you mean? I pulled the original lease agreement and the insurance policy May signed when she moved into that apartment 2 years ago. Your parents. David and Kimberly were listed as primary beneficiaries on that policy from day one. I frowned. I don't remember doing that. You probably didn't, Michael said. They likely had you sign a stack of papers and slipped it in. This wasn't a recent change. May. This was systematic. They set this up. Just waiting for a contingency. The air left my lungs. Waiting. It gets worse, Michael said. And his voice was grim. I ran a public records check on their business. Their restaurant. It's not the success story they're projecting. It's drowning. Their leverage to the hilt. And they just missed a major balloon payment on their loan. They are, to be precise, $120,000 in debt and facing foreclosure within 60 days. The kitchen was silent. I just stared at the wood grain on the table. It all clicked into place. The food critic. The terrible timing. The desperate phone call to the insurance company. Aunt Michelle whispered it first. So the fire. The fire wasn't a tragedy for them, Michael said, finishing her thought. It was a lifeline. They saw that $80,000 payout as their personal bailout. This wasn't a moment of panic. May. This was calculated. This is fraud. The word fraud hung in the air. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a crime. I looked at my aunt. The last little piece of me that hoped this was all a terrible, desperate misunderstanding just broke. It turned into something cold and hard. What do we do? Michael asked. My voice didn't even shake. We act first. We act decisively, he said. I'm drafting 2 things right now. First, a formal cease and desist and a revocation of beneficiary rights. Effective immediately. Second, we're preparing a civil complaint. We're going to hit them before they even know what's happening. Good, I said. Do it. We chose our moment. It was the following Tuesday, the night of the big review. Michael had the papers couriered by a process server. But we decided to deliver a copy ourselves. Aunt Michelle called it a necessary closing statement. The restaurant was cold. Just like I remembered. All polished dark wood and cold. Gray marble. It was trying so hard to be important. It was also mostly empty. My father, David, and my mother, Kimberly, were standing near the hostess stand. Their backs rigid with anxiety. They were dressed perfectly. My mother's smile was shellacked on. Ready for the critic. Then they saw us. Aunt Michelle, me, and Michael, who looked calm and imposing in a dark suit. My father's smile didn't just drop. It inverted into a snarl. He strode toward us. His voice a low, furious growl. May. What are you doing here? You're making a scene. My mother, Kimberly, glided up behind him, her eyes darting toward the few occupied tables. May. Darling, she hissed, her smile twitching. Whatever this is, clients can see you. We'll talk about this later. No, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut right through the soft classical music. We're going to talk about it now. I stepped forward to the polished hostess stand and placed a thick envelope on the reservation book. What is this? David snapped. That, I said, looking him dead in the eye, is a legal restraining order and a formal revocation of any and all beneficiary rights to my insurance policy. His face started to turn a dull, blotchy red. You Dara. Michael stepped forward and placed a second, thicker envelope next to mine. And this? Mr. Perry, Michael said, his voice polite and brutal, is our office's notice of intent to file a civil suit for fraud, conspiracy, and emotional distress, pending the return of the $80,000 you attempted to illegally divert from your daughter. My mother's hand flew to her pearls. Frau Tau. How dare you? We were trying to protect her. Protect me, I asked. The coldness that had been building inside me finally found its voice. Protect me by stealing from me. Was that to protect me from the $120,000 of debt you're hiding? Was the restaurant facing foreclosure? Dad, David's composure completely shattered. The mask of the successful restaurateur just melted away, revealing the desperate, cornered man underneath. "You ungrateful," he roared, his voice echoing in the half-empty dining room. "After everything we've given you, after all we've done, your aunt has poisoned you against us." He raised his hand, pointing a shaking finger at me, his face purple. And right at that exact moment, the front door opened. A man and a woman stood there, notebooks in hand. Looking around, the man checked his reservation. "David Perry, we're from the Chronicle." My father froze, his hands still in the air, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. My mother looked like she'd seen a ghost. I just stood there, calm. The food critic stared at my father, who was still breathing like a bull. Then at my mother, whose smile was frozen in a rictus of horror. Then he looked at the 2 legal envelopes marked "Civil Complaint" sitting on the hostess stand. I didn't have to say another word. My father had said it all. I looked at my mother. "You were worried I'd make a scene," I said softly. Then I turned around, and with Aunt Michelle and Michael on either side of me, I walked out the door, leaving them standing in the ruins of their own creation. We didn't have to go to court, faced with a lawsuit for fraud, the testimony of the insurance adjuster, and the very public, very humiliating review from the Chronicle critic, who wrote a scathing piece about the shockingly toxic atmosphere and desperate, frantic owners. They had no fight left. My parents, David and Kimberly, signed every paper Michael put in front of them. They signed away any claim to the $80,000. They signed the agreement to pay an additional $25,000 in damages. They signed the restraining order. The money from the insurance company hit my account 2 days later. The restaurant's collapse was quiet and total, without the $80,000 lifeline they were counting on, and with their reputation in ashes. The bank foreclosed. The brand they had sacrificed everything, for the brand they had sacrificed me for, was gone within a month. I was sitting in Aunt Michelle's kitchen when Michael's email came through, confirming the final wire transfer for the damages. I stared at the screen, at the numbers. But I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry. I just felt still. For years, I thought family was a bond, something unbreakable. It wasn't. For them, it was a convenience, a contract, and I had been the one paying all the dues. I realized cutting them off wasn't an act of anger. It was just an ending. It wasn't about revenge. It was about self-preservation. It wasn't about destroying their family. It was about finally giving myself permission to build my own. 6 months later, sunlight poured into my new apartment. It was smaller than my old one, but it was all mine. Filled with light and second-hand furniture I'd found and refinished myself. Aunt Michelle was standing on a stool, helping me hang a painting. "A little to the left," I said, squinting. She nudged it. "Perfect." The $25,000 in damages had been just enough to put down a deposit and buy a new laptop. I'd started my own freelance design business. I was finally, actually, doing it. My phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was. My mother, Kimberly. "We lost everything." It read, "The house, the business. Your father is a broken man. Don't you feel guilty?" I stared at the words. I waited for the old, familiar pang of guilt, the urge to apologize, to make it better. Nothing came. It was just quiet. I held my thumb over the screen, pressed block, and deleted the message. Aunt Michelle looked over. "Everything okay, honey?" I smiled, putting the phone face down. "Everything's perfect." I walked over to my desk, which was cluttered with papers and color swatches. I picked up the one thing I'd saved from the fire, my old sketchbook. The edges were still slightly singed. I opened it to a blank page, picked up my pen, and in the quiet, sunlit room, I began to draw. The silence didn't feel empty. It didn't feel lonely. It felt like peace. If you've ever had to choose between your family and your own sanity, share your story in the comments. You are not alone, And remember to subscribe, because there's always another story to tell.